Hello, I'm Caroline Holmes and I'm a garden historian. And as you can see, I'm going to be talking about Monet's garden in Giverny. I've written many books, 12, the 12th is about to be published, but my most popular book has been Monet at Giverny, which has been translated into French, Norwegian, and this year into Chinese. And in the last 3 decades, I have been to Monet's garden every month of the year, not every year, every month of the year, but every month except January. At some point, I've got to get there in January. And from the point of view of those who've been on Viking cruises, some of you may have heard me give the talk about when Monet's trip to Norway on Viking homelands. And the wonderful, he just went there very briefly, sort of sunlight on snow. And next year, we are going to stop at Honfleur on trade routes of the medieval ages, but we're going to move up a little bit and hopefully go and see Giverny itself and visit Monet's garden. You must go to Giverny to see Monet so that you can know him, understand his character, his lifestyle, his inner self. He is a man who has lived, known deep affections, family responsibilities, paternal anxieties, the loss of his friends Caillebotte, Sisley, de Belliot, Pizarro, Renoir, Merbeau, Degas, the terrible bereavement of his nearest and dearest, which broke his heart and ravaged his spirit. He has survived because of an inner strength, an invincible force that was not just physical, but animated by the burning desire of art. This house and garden is also a work of art, and Monet has put all his life into creating and perfecting it. And his good friend, the art critic Gustave Geoffroy, wrote that in 1924. And the extraordinary thing is that Monet spent exactly half his life here. He arrived coming up for 43 and he died here aged 86. But we need to set the scene a little. So we're going to go back to 1873, the artist's house at Argenteuil, which you can see very clearly here. And it's a rather sort of smart house there, the elegant wife looking out at the door at the child with his hoop. We're looking at his first wife, Camille, and we're looking at the young Jean Monet with his hoop. And Monet, during the Franco-Prussian War of the 1870s, had come to London, and indeed he also went to Holland. But while he was in London, he became fascinated by gardens and the way the English gardened in a quite a loose, very non-French way of gardening. And he loved the idea that you couldn't quite see all the way through the garden, that you would mask the footings of the house with plants. You'd grow plants up over the facade, and then you might use these glorious blue pots that he's got there. A year after he painted this, he put in possibly his most famous painting into an exhibition called the Sunrise Impression, or Impression Sun Rising, whichever way you want to translate it. And a critic came and said, "Puh, that's all it is, a mere impression." And Monet and his friends said, "Right, we'll call ourselves the Impressionists." So that's 1874. If we move on, and we see here, we can see the blue pots, but you get that sense of all your happiness being drained from you. And they had moved to Vetheuil, and that lovely, elegant Camille had been desperately ill after the birth of their second child, Michel. And a good friend, Alice Hochedet, had come and nursed Camille through her final illness. And she had brought her 6 children because her husband had left her with the 6 children. And here they were in 1881, 2 little boys who'd lost their mother, another woman with her 6 children, and life had to move on. And you sense that in that painting, that there is a gardener, he's got his canes ready, he's got his tools ready, there is sunshine at the end of the tunnel, and he's got to make a move and do something about it. And so 1883, April 1883, Alice says, we have 8 children who need decent schools, we need a bigger house, go out and find it. So I thought we'd start, because not necessarily all of you will have been lucky enough to visit Giverny, with a plan of the site. And forgive all the little coloured arrows which you can see all over the place, but I hope they'll help to set the scene. Let's start at the top of this plan. Well, do you know what? There wasn't a Rue Claude Monet when they arrived. It was a Rue de Village. And Monet walked down it and he saw this lovely pink house with what is now known as Vert Monet, Monet's green shutters. And he thought, that's exactly what we need. And it was a man called Louis Singulo, and he had been in Guadeloupe and he liked those warm colours. And Monet said, right, we're going to rent this. And by the 29th of April, they had signed up and were ready to rent it. Now, the house itself, number 1, yellow arrows, sits right on the street. And the above, you can see it's called Le Clos Normand. When Monet found it, it was known as Le Pressoir, because where that yellow arrow is, will also be the place where he has his first studio, was a farmhouse, and that whole upper garden was filled with fruit trees, and it was a cider press. Then over time, Monet cleared all the fruit trees out and put in ornamental flowering mallows and prunus. And then you can see put in his pattern of beds so that he could have the arc of the light playing across the gardens. He then builds the second studio in 1897, which you can see blue, painted with blue, and you can see it in the contemporary photograph on the right. And then we come to number 4 on that particular plan. Number 3 is his third atelier, which we will see at the end, but I haven't got a photograph for you to look at it as we look at this particular plan. Much, much bigger greenhouse, which you can see where the orange arrow is. Monet was a very keen grower of orchids, and he raised an awful lot of the plants that he had in his own gardens. And then following the Great Exhibition, Exposition Universelle in 1889, he acquired the land below to create his water garden. So these are gardens that develop very much in 2 parts, and he had to cross the road to get down to the water garden that you can see very, very clearly there. The water garden that we're going to look at, he starts 1893 planting, he gets the land 1890, planting 1893, 1901 he extends it, and he extends it again in 1911 to the size that we can see in the plan there below. So having got to Giverny, Monet was accustomed to going and painting away from home. And this we come back, I've talked about the English influence in the planting in his garden. He then in 1883 travelled down to the Mediterranean with Renoir, who was still living up in Paris at the time, and they went down in order to go and catch up with Cézanne, and then they walked along the coast painting. So this is our only painting by Renoir. All the paintings in this presentation are by Monet unless it says something different. And Renoir said in order to paint olive trees, you had to paint not the leaves but the light between them. And that is very much a Mediterranean scene. But look on the right-hand side, and Monet stayed down and in January went across the Italian border to Bordighera, where there was a very famous garden created by a man called Francesco Moreno. And you can see that those Mediterranean climate plants, aloes coming up in the palms. But what you've got is drama in the foliage and the flowers. And this is also going to feed into Monet's ideas of what he wants to create at Giverny. So back he comes, and word gets out amongst his painting friends that Monet has acquired this wonderful new house and gardens and is doing great things. He's travelling to paint, but he's also going outside the gardens and painting the famous haystacks. This is not one of his series of the poplar trees, but another artist that visited him, John Singer Sargent, painted Monet with Alice's probably second daughter that we can see there, Suzanne. And you can, John Singer Sargent also captures that sort of impressionistic way of painting that was so much a part of Monet. And if we move on, he then 1886 he goes away again and he travels back to Holland, And he's very struck, and this is the third serious influence in the way he designs the gardens. He's very struck by the block plantings in the bulb fields, because you would, if you've got a block of certain tulip, that's the way you want them all together. And he looked at the way the light, and let's remember that for Monet, it's what he called the envelope. What lies between his plant motif and what lies between him was that envelope of colour and movement and effect, and that's what he wanted to catch in his paintings. And he comes back from Holland and he paints his own elder son Jean, the little boy we saw with the hoop earlier on, and again Suzanne. And every parent has ideas of what their children should be doing. And Monet thought it'd be very nice if Jean got together with Suzanne. Well, needless to say, it didn't happen. But what we're looking at there is absolutely spring. It makes you smile. And those of us who are in the Northern Hemisphere, as spring is beginning to break, understand the way the sun filters through the leaves and the blossom. One of the revolutionary things that Monet was doing, an idea he brought back from Britain, was planting bulbs in the grass. And you can see underneath Jean and Suzanne, you can see the trace of all the bulbs growing, naturalizing in the grass. And if you look very carefully through those grasses, you can see a wall, a solid wall. Now, I've mentioned that Monet did go out and paint, and in a moment we'll see the little boat that he used to paint when he was on the River Epte, or one of the other smaller rivers. Can you imagine 1886 in Normandy? You have an artist, and he arrives with a woman to whom he is not married, with 8 children. They wear Parisian clothes, and they are absolutely viewed as beyond the pale. Everything about them is not what a decent Norman would be looking for. And there was a lot of trouble. They actually had vandalism against them, and they were not popular at all. And very curiously, and you can go online and look at this, the Royal Academy's front cover for their latest edition is celebrating the spring. And I'm going slightly off because I think it's such an interesting connection. And they are using David Hockney's paintings he has done in Normandy, but he's done them on his sort of laptop, which I think is absolutely splendid. And this glorious summary of spring has been written by Ali Smith, looking at David Hockney's spring series painted last year. Spring, a word coined for the coiled energy, the upward thrust at this time of year of sap through roots and trunks, buds through cold branch ends. And this is looking very cold. This is, I did say I'd been there every month except for January. This is November, and it gives you an idea of the amount of work that goes on. So when people think of Giverny, they think on the one hand of Monet's paintings, and there are a lot of photographs that have survived, but they also think of the amazing restoration that has taken place since the 1980s when I first went there. And every year, in order to get the Monet effect, they have to clear vast areas of the flower beds. And the great thing about the house at Giverny is its facade, if you like, on the street, that is to the north. So the arc of the sun comes all the way round the gardens. So these great long beds of plants, and we'll see all the different plants, capture and reflect the light in all sorts of different ways right the way through the day. Even on a dull day, they are very interesting. But that, I always feel it's a bit like a dog that's jumped into water, and you come up, you see what a small skeleton is underneath all the fur. But let's look and look at it looking a bit better in spring. We look at the tulips that he's planted on this froth, and we've already seen the way he disguised the footings of his house at Argenteuil. And here you've got the tulips held up in a sea of forget-me-nots, which we routinely see today. But when Monet did this, it was absolutely revolutionary. You had very nice beds of tulips, very formally laid out. You didn't disguise their stems in this particular way. You can see the way he's trained plants against the house. He added the veranda that you can see there. He never had any sculpture in the garden. but he liked to take his pictorial composition up into the sky, and you can see the various they're tripods that he's got. They've been made by the local blacksmiths, but he also had them in wood. And at the time, it's worth remembering all the lovely new Lonicera, honeysuckle and clematis that were coming in from Japan and from the Far East. So there was a huge range of plants that he could choose from. These three views give you an idea of bringing it back, the way the light plays, the envelope that's there. And on the one hand, as we go look on the left, you see those tulips in their sea of forget-me-nots. And if you look behind that, the double doors there, that was where the apples were stored when it was Le Pressoir, and that is what became Monet's first studio, which is now actually, or became a sitting room for the family. Then we look down, and his other hallmark plants, of course, are the irises, and we're going to see a lot more irises. We look down there with the Grande Allée on the right of the photograph. The photograph on the far right is the Grande Allée in late September, when the nasturtiums are completely covering the ground, when the shaggy sunflowers are fighting for the light and the roses have gone all the way over the canopy that you can see there. Again, a sort of before and after, very early February, this particular picture in the top left-hand corner, as I've put very clearly there. And again, you get an idea of structure. As you look through, I pointed out the second atelier to you. That is what you're looking through at the end there. And they planted a very short lime allée where they would put their table down to go and eat outside. And then the picture on the right-hand side, late April, Monet would buy in, having been inspired by Holland and the bulb fields. Every year he bought in all sorts of really beautiful different tulip varieties that he could get hold of. He would then, you can see there, very simple things like white winter pansies. He would also have wallflowers. In all these pictures, we can't hear or smell or touch anything. And it's worth remembering that all those senses were also given free rein in various different ways. So at this particular point in the year, we're imbibing the wonderful scent of the wallflower that we can see very clearly. And here is the man himself, 1920. By this stage, so 1883, he has arrived, and we're looking at 40 years, nearly 40 years later. Extraordinary quality in this picture, and his love of colour. And the climbing plants up the tripod that you can see there, I've come to the conclusion have got to be a cinnamon vine, but I'm still not entirely happy as to what plant that is. But these massed plantings of pelargoniums or geraniums, the standard roses, so you've got this composition, the standard roses standing and rising out of the massed planting of the pelargoniums that you can see underneath. The house swathed in Virginia creeper. And then note round the beds, you have got pinks, dianthus that have finished, but what a fabulous scent they would have had in July. Going down the garden, we're going to look at Les Planches, and the gardeners today call it the graveyard, and you can see why when you see all the beds going down the garden very clearly there. And Monet had this idea, and you can see in the picture on the right-hand top side that I haven't got it upside down. It is peonies underneath a thatched roof that was painted in 1887. And Monet had the idea that a lot of plants need some kind of shade from the harshness of the summer, or in the case of the peonies, those beautiful, huge herbaceous peonies can be spoilt by rain. And that if you created a roof, rather than creating it in thatch, you create it in something like clematis. I'll show you a photograph in a minute. You would provide a dappled shade. You'd provide shelter if the rain came in, which it certainly can in Normandy. And then you've got this repetition of the motif as you make your way down the garden. And of course, they are facing south as they go down the garden. And I've just put a picture of September. We're going to see a May picture in a minute to show you how, again, the clambering. So you go now you don't see peonies. There are peonies elsewhere in the garden, but you've got those spring into summer peonies. They are followed by campanulas and lupins and peonies, and cleomes, all sorts of other plants, and in certain cases roses as well. And here we've got it in the spring. Les planches actually just means planks. They're also known as the clematis rooms. And on the left-hand side, you can very clearly see Clematis montana, and improved varieties of those started coming in at the turn of the 20th century. 1905, there's one called Elizabeth that was particularly good that he grew. And you can see how you've got semi-shade loving plants that are enjoying the shelter of the montana clematis that you've got there. And then looking down later in the year, you can see this mixture of colours underneath the safe canopy of the clematis rooms that you've got above them. Word got out, an American arrived in Giverny and discovered he was in the same village where Monet lived. So everybody wanted to come here. So one of the very first that came here was John Leslie Breck and Willard Metcalf and Theodore Robinson and Carroll Beckwith, who painted that lovely, James Carroll Beckwith, who painted that lovely portrait of Breck. In actual fact, Monet didn't want to have anything to do with other artists, and what we find increasingly during his time at Giverny is his friends are gardening friends. And he also goes up to Paris and he mixes with writers, and his whole circle changes completely. His old artist friends he keeps in touch with. But I can't resist putting this in as another bit of Giverny. If you go to Giverny, do walk up the street and go to the Ancienne Hôtel Baudy and have a very nice coffee and a lemon tart or some lunch. But anyway, John Leslie Breck is there. And he decides with the other Americans that they really do need a tennis court. And the Hochet girls, Alice Hochet's 4 daughters, make their way up and have a very good time with all these young American artists, much to Monet's disgust. And here we see John Leslie Breck, and he starts to date Blanche Hochet. And thank goodness he did, because somewhere between 1887 and 1891, he was given permission by Monet. This is the only other person that paints in Monet's garden, is his stepdaughter to be, daughter-in-law to be Blanche Hochet. But this is very early days. So we'll say that Monet, this is in the first 10 years of Monet being here. And we see how the south of France, Italy, has influenced him. They're not Mediterranean plants, but they're fighting for the light. There's lots of wonderful foliage there, good old sunflowers, and you've got lots of poppies that are there, and you've got peonies that are there, and the path disappearing as those plants scramble for the light and come up. And actually Leslie Breck went back to the States, and he is reputed to have introduced Impressionism into the States. Whether he did or not is another matter, but he certainly went back. Tragically, he died very, very young indeed. And contemporary visitors talked about the shock of the new, that he had all these plants of all sorts of different heights, which you didn't see in English gardens either. Now, I mentioned the series, I very briefly mentioned the grain stacks, and of course the other famous series are the poplars. And I mentioned the little painting boat that Monet had, and sadly people in the village vandalized that, and he had to have it all repaired. But this is, again, the way Monet looks at things. He became fascinated by the poplar. At that time in France, they were a crop that was gathered in between 10 and 20 years and used to make matchsticks. And Monet was painting these poplars, and he liked to be in the boat because he liked the effect of looking right up into the sky and seeing their leaves against the sky. And then, of course, the time came for them to be cut down, and he paid for them not to be cut down. And he very definitely saved them, and we'll see what he did at his own garden as well. Now, you may wonder why I've got 2007 and 2019 in my pictures here. And the garden has evolved. The restoration properly started in the 1980s. And if you look, they're both views from Monet's bedroom. If you look down at the bigger picture, which I took in July 2007, what you can see is that the gardens are stopped by a screen of poplars. And they made the most wonderful sound in the garden. And this was something that Monet liked very much indeed. But there's been a policy in Giverny of going back to what would have been planted there, and there wouldn't have been poplars other than Monet, and they have taken them all down, which you can see very clearly on the right. But we will see when we get to the water garden, in the end, this has proved to be a very good thing. As we look from Monet's bedroom window, you will again search to find a vanishing point. And Monet, as a student, collected Japanese prints, Ushigawa, Hiroshiga, for example. And on those prints, there is never a vanishing point. Your eye travels from left to right as you're looking down the gardens. And that is exactly what he tried to create as you look at the gardens, and allow your eye to do all the work for you. And look at the way the different light, because by chance, the one I took on the right was taken late in the afternoon, and the one that I took on the left was taken much earlier, and you can see the difference in the sunlight between the two of them. I mentioned the Exposition Universelle in 1889, but building up to that, a man called Godfrey Leboeuf. Godfrey Leboeuf was a very fine horticulturalist and nurseryman based at Argenteuil. And the artist Gustave Caillebotte introduced Monet to Godfrey Leboeuf. Now, if you look very carefully, you will see there is no mention of the name Monet here. This letter on the left, dated the 24th of March, 1887, to Godfrey Leboeuf, was written by the man whose name you can see on the right, Bory Latour Marliac, who was based down in Temple-sur-Lot, which is about 100 kilometers east of Bordeaux. And Bory Latour Marliac was very impressed by Godfrey Leboeuf's creation of a top-class gardening magazine called Le Jardin. And Godfrey Leboeuf commissioned people who were ahead of the field, the latest introductions into French gardens, and he got people not only to write about them, but how to grow them. And he approached Bory Latour Marliac and asked him to write about water lily, nymphea, and nelumbium lotus. Rustique, hardy, that could be grown in gardens across France. And on the right, you can see the paper, the notice that he wrote and was published separately from Le Jardin in 1888. And this is very important. I think water lilies, you're already ahead of me on what I'm going to say. So the Exposition Universelle, 1889, to celebrate the centenary of the French Revolution. And everybody was so relieved that that hideous tower designed by Gustave Eiffel was only up for 1 year. Monet loathed it, and many, many other people loathed it. Looking, as we are in the photograph on the right, out across the river, you see the Trocadero. Those of you who've been to Paris will know that it doesn't look anything like that anymore. That Trocadero, Palais de Trocadero, was pulled down for the 1925 exhibition. But if you look across at the sort of wonderful card of everything happening at the Exposition Universelle on the left, you will see the Excedra there, the sort of demi-lune shape. That was where all the nurseries were. And Monet was exhibiting further up on the other side of the river. But he talks about going down and having all sorts of wonderful ideas for plants for his particular garden. I mentioned already he puts in a planning application for the water garden 1893. By 1890, he has determined that he's going to buy the land below or acquire the land below. And on the left-hand side, you can see his planning permission that he put in. And I put a little photograph of the house so you can get an idea of where the house is in relation to the water garden below. And you can see it's a much more modest water garden than the one he's going to have in the end. Well, the local people said, we know what sort of a man he is. He is going to poison the water with all those curious plants that he grows. So there was a lot of toing and froing and arguing, and I won't read you all the correspondence, but finally Paris, the Jardin des Plantes in Paris, interfered, as did the Rouen Botanic Garden, and said, he's a thoroughly nice chap, you can let him grow whatever it is and you will not be poisoning your livestock. So he got permission to put his first pond in. And if you look below, you can see I've said the 8th of October 1901. It's quite difficult, it doesn't look that different, but he then gets permission to extend it. And what I've then put in this particular big, far too much for you to look at really, is an idea of the little river Rue, whose name you can probably see. The Rue led to the Epte leads to the Seine. So you're broadly speaking in the Seine Valley here. And he uses that water to create his pond. And then it's all properly, you can see, sort of canalized today. And a year later, he puts in an order to La Tour Marliac, Bory La Tour Marliac, whose paper you saw was published in Le Jardin. Monet was another subscriber to Le Jardin. He must have read La Tour Marliac's notice. And he also surely went and looked at his exhibition at the Exposition Universelle. La Tour Marliac had won a gold medal for all his water plants. So this first order for the water garden, and if you look and you're running your eye through those plants, you will need to go to page 2 before you see any mention of water lilies. And you will see, if you can read the writing, Nymphea flava, yellow, Nymphea ledecari, pink, and Nymphea sulphurea grandiflorum, big yellow flowering water lily. Below, 4 Nelumbium or lotus varieties, also yellows and pinks. And La Tour Marliac had bred his own Nelumbium called Azaris, which you can see there on the right. And it's one of those what if moments, because there is not a single painting with a lotus. And on that letter, La Tour Marliac writes, well, you might get them to grow in Normandy, but I don't think so. And what lotus need is not so much the cold in the winter that kills them. If they haven't had real heat in the summer to ripen, they are unlikely to survive a cold winter. Jumping to 1899, he did his first essay in about 1895, but this is the first real painting that celebrates what he has created. And did he at that moment realize he had created something totally unique? Because people had formal water pools and they had lakes and they had ponds, but this is an absolute canvas. He puts his single bridge over the top, which will get a top canopy some 10 years later. And then the water itself is both a host for the water lilies, the marginal plants. It's also a mirror for what is going on around the garden. We can see the willows reflected, looking like they're mixing with the weeds that are growing underneath in the pond. And it's a quite extraordinary composition. And then the pinks of those water lilies I talked about, and the yellows dotted all the way across. You almost feel you could walk across that painting. For those of you who are keen on plants, I hope your eye has been running down the right-hand side, because those are the other plants that Monet ordered at the time. A real symphony of pinks and yellows and green. And this is a particularly sunny painting that we can see here. 1900, he goes back to painting the upper garden because he still wants to do other things. And as I said, he's going to extend the water garden a year later. I mentioned irises right at the beginning. At this time, there are so many iris varieties that are coming onto the market. He buys a lot of irises in also from English nurseries such as Kelway's. Now, the iris itself has the three falls and the 3 standards, the 3 petals that stand up. So that, as a potential for capturing the sunlight as it moves around, is absolutely extraordinary. What with that and the sword-like leaves, the irises are fabulous, you know, he and Van Gogh. And if you look behind, you will see not hoops, which is what we're accustomed to, but tree trunks. And when they arrived at Le Pressoir, Alice did not want all the little box-edged beds taken out. She did not want the Grande Allée removed. And she fought. And she said, we're keeping the spruce and we're keeping the cypresses that line that Grande Allée. It's the only thing that's organised in our lives. And so what Monet did was to strip the trunks and grow roses all the way up. And you can see it more clearly in the next images that we've got. And you can see particularly on the right how the branches are weighed down with roses. And you can also very clearly see how clear the trunks are. And again, I come back to the shelter of this particular garden. If you look behind the house, that hill is protecting the house from the northerly winds. Not only is the eye deceived into thinking it's going into a total floral tunnel, but he emphasizes that by building up the flower beds at the base of the trees and then allowing the plants to cascade down and then cover the plant. And we've already had one picture of those nasturtiums, and the one on the right shows you that very, very clearly indeed. And here is the Grande Allée, as you might have seen it over the years at various points. Now, the one in the middle, I was keynote speaker at the International Water Garden Symposium, organised, I might say, from the United States at Giverny. And afterwards, the head gardener said, well, if you get here at 7 a.m, he said, I'll let you in, you can have the garden to yourself. Well, I was absolutely there, 5 to 7 at the gates. And I took this picture. This is August 2019, as the sun is coming up. And they clean they wash down every single path every morning because of the numbers of visitors. And I just think it is this quiet moment before they are inundated with visits. You can see the way the sun from the east is running across the plants as you look down the Grande Allée. And then they're not in any particular sequence. I mean, down the bottom right-hand corner is a picture that was taken in June. And then up above that was one taken in July. To the left, that's in September. It's another August early morning. And then up on the top left was one taken in September, when you can see that the nasturtiums are really coming in. You can also see those planches, the clematis rooms to the left up there in the top left-hand corner. And I'm equally looking the other way. So we're looking down the garden left-hand corner, up the garden on the right-hand top corner, with the clematis rooms on the other side of it. And to stay with flowers, so really I've only talked about tulips, peonies, and we've seen clematis and sunflowers, and here the chrysanthemums, 1897. And they look like a big box of sweeties or something, and lots of wonderful colours. And look at the shaggy flower heads of the different chrysanthemums that he's got there, all capturing the light in a slightly different way, mass planted, no sort of pinks and yellows and oranges, they're all in there together. And I took this photograph, again, it's one of my early morning sojourns in 2019. And I love the Rudbeckia because of the story behind it. And it was named by Carl Linnaeus. And when the plant was introduced from South Africa and it came into flower, Linnaeus remembered that as a young man, he had lived with Olaf Rudbeck, who was a very fine botanist. And Rudbeck had some 16 children who, needless to say, made quite a lot of noise. And when all those flowers came up, Linnaeus said, oh my goodness, it's like all those Rudbecks. I'm going to call this plant Rudbeckia. Behind the house that you can see was house for Monet's head gardener. And here is his potentially most famous head gardener, Felix Breuil. And through the botanical gardens in Rouen, he got other gardeners, but let's look at Felix Breuil. And if you look in the background, you can see the size of the greenhouse that Monet had. He had an American neighbour who he did get on with, who was allowed into the garden, Lila Cabot Perry, and she told a lovely story that when they changed the heating system in the huge greenhouse that you can see there, Monet was very concerned that it might break down during the night. So he said, I'm going to sleep in the greenhouse, so next to the heater, so that if there's any problem I can take whatever actions required. And Alice said, well, you can't possibly sleep in the greenhouse on your own. I'll join you. With which each and every one of the children said, you cannot possibly sit and sleep in the greenhouse on your own. We are going to sleep. The whole family camped in the greenhouse and the heating did not fail. I might say once Alice's husband, Ernest, had died, they did marry, and in time the village became quite fond of them. Looking here in the foreground, I've already talked about the way that the old apple trees were replaced by malus and prunus, flowering apples and flowering cherries. And also dotted about, you can see the standard roses. And Felix Breuil is not particularly short, but the standard roses they had at that time were real rose trees. They were budded at about, nearly over 6 feet. So you got this wonderful cascade of roses coming down. And then, which we don't see today, in the grass, you see these big clumps of irises going all the way up the garden, very, very clearly there indeed. One rose was discovered. I'm not going into the full story of how the gardens faded. I mean, basically, Blanche Rochedet, who I've mentioned, became Monet's daughter-in-law, and when Monet's son Jean died just before the First World War, she then came and effectively looked after Monet because Alice had died in 1911. Blanche looked after the gardens until her own death in 1945. And then Michel, Monet's other son, really wasn't interested at all. He then was killed in a car crash in 1966, and the gardens limped on. And finally, in the 1980s, it was decided to save the gardens, and very few original plants had survived. But one rose, Rose Belle Vichysoise, was found and has been reintroduced into the garden. For those of you who are thinking, goodness me, why name a rose after a cold soup? Vichysoise is the same as Belle Parisienne. It's obviously about some pretty girl or pretty woman who lived in Vichy, and she was La Belle Vichysoise, and the rose was named for her. We don't know who she was, though. This is the bottom of the garden that you can see going along there. Now, coming into the spring again, I have been, one year I went in May 3 times, and the irises were not in flower on one single occasion. So you can see them just bursting into life there. But I wanted to put this in because those irises, we saw the November picture, have to be lifted and split every single year to get the effect that we want. And on the right, you can see the house with the shutters all shut up. It was another occasion when I was there fairly early in the morning. And on the left, you can see the second atelier very clearly there. One other thing that Monet wanted was blue water lilies. And La Tour Marliac, he wrote to people all around the world, he could not breed hardiness into blue water lilies. And it's only been done in Thailand in the last 10 years. But Zanzibariensis azurea was one bred by La Tour Marliac, and Monet ordered it. And there is talk that he heated part of the greenhouse, part of the pond for it. I think it must have been kept in the greenhouse and then brought out when it was really warm and was planted in pots. That's my feeling of how that happened. But he did go on to order 4 much deeper, darker pink water lilies from La Tour Marliac. And the Atropurpurea, which you can see in the far left-hand corner, was one that was bred by La Tour Marliac. Arethusa, William Faulkner and James Bryden had all been bred in the States. And La Tour Marliac, I've I've written a book about him and his work. He had a very good exchange of plants with American nurseries, which I haven't got time to talk about because it's not relevant to what we've got here. But when you look at his 1907 painting of water lilies, note two things. First, the blindingly obvious that the very dark pink of the water lilies look very much like William Faulkner. He also loved the effect of the pads on the water, the lily pads. And then we don't have the bridge, we don't have the margins. We are completely immersed into the effect of the water and its reflections and the plants that are on it. In 1913, Monet painted the rose-covered pergola, which is at the far end, and you can see it here in three different ways. So top left, there it is, 1913, reflecting in the water, covered in roses. And note behind that the poplars are way, way back and there's no planting that's there. If we look at the photograph in 1924 taken with the very famous horticulturalist Georges Truffaut, first of all, in the foreground, we can see wonderful tree peonies, which Monet also liked. And in black and white, if you look on the right-hand corner, sort of centre ground, you can see the rose arbour again. And today, if you look, you can see the rose arbour across the water lilies that we can see very, very clearly there. Well, the First World War breaks out, 1914, and a man called Sacha Guitry, France is devastated, and Monet, by the enormous loss of life. If you've been to any small French village, the numbers you see on their war memorials are terrifying. And so Guitry said, right, let's celebrate the best of French. And he said to Monet, can I come and film you? And Monet said, yes, you can film me by the water lilies. And Monet was also advised to leave Giverny. He could hear the battlefields, but he said, no, I'll die here. Nothing is going to make me move. But what he did do was he had a second garden in Giverny called the Maison Bleue, where he grew vegetables and fruit and mushrooms and spices. And he sent sort of picnic baskets, panniers of fresh fruit and vegetables to the nearby field hospitals. At the same time, before the First World War, so he'd lost Alice in 1911. He lost his son Jean of an awful wasting disease in end of 1913, tipping into 1914. And he was also having increasing problems with cataracts. And I think I've shown so many, and I will show so many very serene paintings of the water. This is an angry painting of the water lily pond. What was Monet going to do? He was definitely going to carry on gardening. Nothing would stop him gardening, nor painting. But his very good friend Clemenceau said, you have got to do something for the French nation. And on the right-hand side at the bottom, during the war, he had the third atelier built, where he could create these enormous canvases. And that is where we will finish tonight when I get there. But I couldn't resist putting in this little story. Sacha Guitry introduced Marguerite Namara before the First World War to Monet, and he took this rather splendid photograph. I love her slightly proprietorial hand on his shoulder. Monet apparently had a wonderful baritone voice. There is no record of whether he sang with Marguerite Namara or not, but she's a very interesting, she was an American lyric soprano. And as a teenager, she sang for Thomas Edison in the flower duet from Delibes' opera L'Acmé. She appeared at the Opera Comique in Paris, and she was very good friends with Rodin, as was Monet, Debussy, Picasso, Isadora Duncan, who also lived in Giverny and danced naked on her lawns every morning. And she said, I'm going to come back after the First World War, and we see her there, and I'm going to sing to you by your water lilies, which she very definitely did. And whatever else she did, any of you who have ever done any French, if you read what she wrote to Monet, will realize that obviously learning French was not high on her list of things to do. So to finish, where we've got I want to look at this water garden, which particularly from an artistic point of view, from a painting point of view, rather than artistic point of view, is Monet's great memorial. He, as I've already said, created something unique. And you can see that rose arbor again, absolutely covered in roses. And you can see a pergola going all the way along. Now, the other plant, which curiously Monet only grew in the water garden, was wisteria. And we famously can think of the wisteria over the Japanese bridge, with white wisteria around the base and purple wisteria over the top. And you can look across, you can see the reflections and note the light coming in from the right-hand side and the fabulous willows coming down. This photograph is in the 1920s. Monet will die in 1926, so this is towards the end of his life. We've got the wonderful Sulfurea grandiflora, the yellow water lily that had ordered right at the beginning, and I put the Arethusa back in there. And just an idea of the kind of colours that he would have been looking across at that point. This picture, I didn't say when I showed you the lovely picture of Monet in his garden with all the pelargoniums and the pinks around the edge and the roses. L'Illustration came in 1921, took a whole lot of these extraordinary photographs. Then after he died, they touched them up, and this is a rather sombre touching up, I think, of the water garden, and they've only shown white water lilies, which is very disappointing indeed. But what you can see here is that as the water garden developed, Monet went and became very much more Japanese in the way the banks melt into the water. He had a gardener whose sole job was to ensure the pictorial composition of his water lilies. This was no garden by chance, and yet it oozed and breathed a sort of a naturalness that was very much something that he prized. And here we are in 2019, and they have done literally 5 years ago, they realized that the trees along the south border were creating so much shade that the water lilies were not doing as well as they might have done. So they have cut them down, and it's improved. And if you look very carefully, the sun is shining really, really brightly on the water here, but you get the idea of the reflections. You get the idea of the colours of the water lilies. And I tell you something else, if you look very carefully, you'll see that that water garden is stacked with people. The marvellous thing about the water garden is, do you know, there aren't any visitors yet who can walk on water. So I'm going to finish with two images because I wanted to visit Giverny, as it were, in two places. The other place you can visit what Monet created is by going to the Musée de l'Orangerie, where he chose the two oval basements to hang his water lily series. And these were a remembrance of all the people who had died during the First World War. But he said they were not to be hung, they were not to be put up until after his death. He died in December 1926, and they were opened in May 1927. So let's listen to the words of his dearest friend Clemenceau as we look at our last two images. And the action of this battlefield, it is life itself, luminously transposed. Here the drama of the Nymphaeas unfolds across the world's stage. This drama culminates in the lightning-like flash of a fire that blinds us, the blaze of the setting sun amid the stark reeds of the wintry marsh, in which there will again grow the entrancing blooms of springtime. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Caroline. We've now got some questions who have come in from our viewers. So I'll start with our first question. It's from Hugh in Beverly Hills. He says, it was often said that some of Monet's paintings were actually done in paint by number format. Is there any truth to this claim?
I think that's very rude. No, I did. Well, no, and that's, how do you define, no, paint by numbers. He certainly had, when he had his cataracts, he had the paints labelled on his easel because he couldn't see the colours. And I don't know whether that's where that started. But no, he applied, he certainly knew which colours he wanted to use. I would not, whereas the painting by numbers to me implies that he numbered his whole composition and then put the painting in. And that I wouldn't agree with.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Betty in the United States, and we have had a number of similar questions. So she says, what is the best time of year, in your opinion, to visit the garden?
Yes, that's a very popular question. I'm going to answer it in more than one part. To me, late April, May, the spring, there's something about spring. And if you tipping into May, you'll get the irises as well. But there is so many glorious spring plants, absolutely fabulous. Very much the upper garden. I would then go for August, September, if you like a slightly unkempt garden, if you want to see the water lilies, then all of that, it's absolutely buzzing with plants. So it's rather more organised in spring. So it depends what your taste is, but those would be my two times.
Thank you. Next question comes from Marlene in St. Cloud in the United States. She says, did Monet think very highly of Cézanne's paintings?
Oh, that's a good question. They were very good friends, and he certainly, yes, to think highly. Yes, he appreciated Cézanne's work, although it was very different from his own. And I think that is a very good question, because we talk about impressionists, and in many respects, I mean, going back to the sort of painting by numbers, Monet moved away from being an impressionist, but his garden and what he created is so impressionistic that we're left with it. Whereas Cézanne doesn't paint plants so much, but paints views, and has a very different approach. And the other part of that friendship, of course, is Émile Zola, who wrote J'accuse in 1898, when there was the Dreyfus case, and they were very involved in that. But that's not answering the question about whether that's why he and Renoir went down to see Cézanne. They were painters in a very different style, but they appreciated each other's styles.
Thank you. Next question comes from Randy in Fayetteville in the United States. He says, years ago, I saw some of Monet's paintings of water lilies in the Cleveland Art Museum. How many in this genre did he paint?
Hundreds. The Cleveland Art Museum is lovely. Yes, how very nice to go there. Yes, he painted hundreds, and that's an extremely interesting question. So I talked about Monet dying in December 1926. And I then talked about his own son, Michel, dying in 1966. So Monet had chosen which paintings he wanted to go into the basement rooms at the Musée de l'Orangerie. He had indeed been selling water lily paintings, but he had also been experimenting. He destroyed loads of them. He'd get into a fit of temper that he didn't like them. But he left behind stacks of water lily paintings, there's this argument, did he ever intend for the public to see them? But what happened, first of all, his son Michel, whenever he needed some money, would go into his father's studio and sell a few more paintings. America was always, from the 1890s onwards, a very good market. Durand-Ruel set up the market for Monet's paintings in the States, and they were his first really good patrons. So there were already American art dealers who were coming to buy during Monet's lifetime, and a lot of those water lilies, I don't know about the Cleveland when they were acquired, but it was from 26 to 66 a slow trickle, and then with Michel's death in 66, a further amount of paintings then came onto the market. So I hope that helps with the answers. You'd need to look when Cleveland acquired the paintings, and that will answer your question.
Thank you. FT in the United States says, what's blooming in October?
Oh, very good question. Last of the water lilies, nasturtiums, because you should be without a frost. I've been there in October. I rather like it in October. The fruit trees all have their fruit on. Wisteria is definitely finished. The pelargoniums are still going because they've not been taken up, and they continue. I hope that's helpful. Those are the main plants that as I think about it, that are there. Yes, those would be the ones that I would pick. But it does depend what season you've had. And you are beginning to get there's quite a lot of shrubs as well. Any of the fall colours are beginning to show, so you might get the benefit of that as well in October.
Wonderful, thank you. Sandra in the United States says, how far is Giverny from Paris by train or by car?
Very good question. It couldn't be easier. It's before Rouen. It's about an hour by train. Go to Gare Montparnasse. It's straight through. Get off at Vernon. And Vernon was where the children went to school, by the way, when Giverny was nice and near. Now, I have done the walk from Vernon to Giverny. It is the most boring walk you could possibly take, so I don't recommend it. But there is a shuttle bus that runs regularly when the gardens are open from Vernon station to the gardens.
Thank you. Lorraine in Wilmington in the United States says, for how long did he live at Giverny?
43 years. So arrived 1883, April 29th, and died there on December, I think it was December the 17th, 1926.
Thank you. Jerry in Kent in the United States says, I'm particularly fond of Van Gogh. Was Monet an influence on him, or was it the reverse, or not at all?
That's an interesting question. Now, he wasn't an influence, but Van Gogh's, my English pronunciation, and if you're in France, it'd be Van Gogh. So Van Gogh, I'd love to do an American pronunciation, as I have an American question. His brother Theodore bought and dealt with some of Monet's early paintings. So the connection's there. The other interesting connection is an Australian connection. John Peter Russell was a very good friend of Van Gogh's, and John Peter Russell moved in the same circles as Rodin and Monet. And Monet visited John Peter Russell at Belle-Île in Brittany. It's a very lengthy way of answering your question. So the influence, it's in the water. And I'm sure you're thinking of the irises, because, why were they both inspired by the irises and Gauguin? But then there's no direct connection. But I find with all these things, the longer you go on, you suddenly think, well, if he knew him, surely that would come. And Monet's works were being exhibited, so even if they didn't meet, and Theodore Van Gogh's brother moved much more in art circles than he did. So no, I don't think there is a direct connection, but it was in the air, in the water.
Wonderful, thank you. Kathy in Garden City asks, what do you think Monet's favourite colour was?
Oh, how appropriate to be in Garden City. His favourite colour. I always think it's pink, but I think it's because I like pink. And actually, when you looked at it, and actually going back to the question about October, the spring is very much pinks and whites. And then when you get further into the year, and it could be the quality of the light, the reds and the yellows are much more dominant. So I can't think of a particular colour that I would instantly say was his favourite colour. The colour it's interesting, of the shutters that I mentioned, Vert Monet, they're known as Monet's green, predate him, because that's just happened to be the colour of the shutters, and it's a very popular colour with people from an interior design point of view.
Thank you. Next question comes from Harry in the United States. He says, is a visit to Monet's garden worth a full day trip, or is the Viking included tour just as good?
Oh, now that's very mean. Oh golly. The maddening thing is, a full day trip is very difficult to do because of the visitor numbers. So there is something, and again, with a Viking trip, which very often groups can do, you get in early, you get in before the crowds. I would hesitate to do a full day trip. If you were doing it independently, there are several very, very nice bed and breakfasts that you can stay in Giverny, and go and get a sense of the place and walk and do 2 half days and go in early in the morning and then go sort of particularly after 4 o'clock, go in the afternoon. So don't go until 3 o'clock, and 4 o'clock all the coaches go, and then you do have the gardens to yourself. I hope that's answering it. There's the advantage of a group tour, and I have led groups there, is that they are organised for your arrival. And so actually moving around the gardens is organised, but you don't get that sort of individual. You can take yourself off actually. But I think unless you could just sit in the garden all day and watch the people. But I think ideally go and stay there if you want to do it properly. Do it that way. Get a taste with a group tour. Yes.
That's very helpful, thank you. Peter in Winston-Salem in the United States says, how did Monet become interested in Asian art?
Well, at the time, the Japanese prints, which are so highly prized now, were used for wrapping. And all sorts of goods came into France from Japan wrapped in these prints. And students, for a few sous, pennies, cents, could buy these prints and, flatten them all out again and have them to decorate their walls. And that fed. So you've got, and I'm very glad you've asked me this question, because on the one hand, you have that just as an art form you put on your wall. When Monet created his gardens, there was question of whether he had been influenced by Japanese gardens. And then that's the next part of the answer. Running parallel with that from 1890 through to the First World War, 1914, there was a big interest in having a Japanese garden. And I can think of lots of Japanese gardens in the States as well. They were all about buying the lantern and having the tea house and this, that and the other. And what is really interesting with Monet was, yes, he was influenced by the prints, but he didn't know the philosophy, he didn't know about Buddhism or Shinto that actually lies behind Japanese garden design. But he had that sense of the sinuous line, the play of light and water. And he had many Japanese visitors, and they said, this garden is so Japanese. So unlike people who were creating Japanese gardens at the time, from a Japanese point of view, he was creating a Japanese garden. Now, just a quick English story. The Rothschilds at Gunnersbury created a Japanese garden in the 1890s, and they invited the Japanese ambassador to come and see it. And he very diplomatically said, we have nothing like this in Japan. Thank you very much for that question.
Thank you, Caroline. Our next question comes from Madeline in Loudon in the United States. She says, how many workers and gardeners did he employ on average to maintain the gardens?
Very good question, which I didn't address. He had at peak 8 gardeners. He had 5 gardeners by the 1890s. His financial position, he arrived in Giverny in 1883, and they'd been terrific spendthrifts and one thing and another, very, very short of money. But I've already mentioned Durand-Ruel organised for sales of Monet's paintings to the States. And then he actually had he used other agents, and he realised that he could make more money doing that. And he started investing on the stock exchange. So by the time we get to the later 1890s, his financial position is far stronger, and he spends an enormous amount of time and money on the gardens. By his death, he's got 8 gardeners. And as I mentioned, he's got that second garden in Giverny, the Maison Bleue, as well.
Thank you. And just linked to that point, Alan in Garnet Valley in the United States says, when and how did Monet get the wealth needed to acquire and develop Giverny?
Well, I think I've answered that one in the last question by chance, by becoming, and actually just I can add to what I've just said about getting the money together. very tragically, Monet died in I think it was 1890. I haven't got the date in front of me, but whatever date it was that Monet died, Monet's widow was very short of money. And so Monet spearheaded a group of people who said the state have got to buy Monet's painting Olympia, and they've got to hang it somewhere really important. And the first good that came out of that was that the Monet family then were not as short of money as they would have been. But what Monet also did was to raise the price bar on impressionist paintings by doing that, because they weren't just being exhibited at sideshows, if for want of a better word. They were in the main French galleries, and they then became altogether much more valuable. The other thing that he did, I pointed out the second atelier two or three times in my talk. He also had a framing area in the second atelier. So not only did you buy his paintings, but you could pay for them to be framed as well. So that was another way of making money.
Wonderful, thank you. Judith in the United States asks, what is the total acres of the garden?
Very good question. It is 4 acres.
Thank you. Next question comes from Nancy in the United States. She says, I was able to visit Giverny for a day in May 2016. The roses were in bud and I want to return someday when they are blooming. What month would you recommend for a visit to Giverny to see the roses in their greatest profusion?
Well, what is she? Because June is a very good month. I was there in 2016, and I think I was there in July in 2016. Some of the photographs I used for 2016. Yes, it's maddening, isn't it? You should have seen them in June, but certainly in July. And they've got remontant roses that repeat flower, as well as the more traditional ones. But yes, end of June, mid-June onwards. I don't know what point in June you went, but you should have been all right for the roses. I'm sorry you missed them.
Thank you. Vivian in Marlow in the United Kingdom says, thank you very much, Caroline. Was Monet a painter or a gardener first?
Oh, he said of himself, what can be said of me? An artist, a gardener. Yes, he put himself as a painter and a gardener and a painter and a gardener. A painter, I mean artist and a gardener. He, in his mind, they were equal. From a contemporary point of view, his gardens were hugely celebrated, much written about. And I would argue probably even today, his name is that of an artist, not a gardener. But I just recently did a series actually on artists and their landscapes and gardens. And there were only 2 of them who really rolled up their sleeves and got on with actually doing the gardening. And Monet certainly did that, particularly at the beginning, because he had no money. So I would still say, and it was the artist in him that informed the way he planted, but he was also a very good plantsman.
Thank you. Jim in the United States says, what was the effect of Monet's deteriorating eyesight on his gardening and his paintings?
That's a very good question. Again, I mean, would you have liked to have sat and listened to me for 3 hours? Probably not. I just briefly mentioned the cataracts. From a gardening point of view, it doesn't seem, because he obviously could see the light and the textures. His temper apparently was just appalling. But finally, in 1922, he was persuaded by Clemenceau and his daughter-in-law Blanche to have the operation. And he kept saying, I'd rather have the awful sight I've got than have no sight at all. And it was a huge success. So for the last 4 years of his life, he could see very clearly again. But I think it's interesting with eyesight. He's a contemporary with our very famous English Edwardian gardener, Gertrude Jekyll, who also had terrible sight problems. And I think with gardening, it is that sense of texture and the health in the plants that you don't need to have the same levels of sight. And sometimes you can pinpoint details that are right or wrong that somebody who has better sight can't. But it certainly affected his painting. And as I mentioned, on his easel, on his palette, it got so bad that he had to have the colours written on his palette for him.
Thank you.
Not at the end.
Thank you. Irene in New York says, how were the water lily painting series transported to the orangery?
You know, oh, they were rolled up. Yes, absolutely. Yes, I haven't had to think about that at all. They were rolled up because they were just huge canvases. They were taken off their stands and then taken up. I would imagine. We are looking at, you see, we've got cars by that stage. I don't think it was train. They would have been driven up. Incidentally, Monet loved fast cars. He had a Panhard Levasseur, and he and Clemenceau used to race each other around the Normandy country lanes. No, it would have been taken up by some early form of lorry.
Thank you. Next question comes from Colleen in Maine. She says, I visited the garden in October 2019. The dahlias were just beautiful. Do they keep the bulbs and winter them, or do they plant new each year?
Very good question. And then now, whoever it was, and I forgot the name of the person who asked, what would they see in October? Dahlias, and I should have mentioned dahlias. Monet, and I haven't mentioned them at all, he loved dahlias. And in his lifetime, they would lift the dahlias because when he was away on painting trips, which is why we know what he did in his garden, he would leave copious notes for the gardeners about what he expected them to do. One of which was make sure you've lifted the dahlias and stored them ready to go out the next year. Today, with the pressure of time, there's probably more buying in than there was in the past.
Thank you.
And storage, yes.
Julie in Minneapolis says, what happened to the gardens during World War II?
Very good question. So as I mentioned, Blanche died in 1945. But during the Second World War, there was very little that she could do, very little help. So when she died, they were already at a very low state of maintenance. The other unfortunate thing was that and I think I'm afraid they were American ships, had they're like a koi pew, which came on board and then rampaged its way across the Normandy countryside and did an enormous amount of damage, eating away the banks of the water garden. So that the water garden essentially was destroyed by that. It was just mud and no edges, they'd all gone. The upper garden was seriously overgrown and just generally hacked back. And so the Second World War was both the end of the garden's maintenance and also the end of Blanche's life. So that combination did mean it really went downhill at that point during the Second World War.
Thank you. Linda in Greenwich in the United States says, it's my understanding that Monet kept very detailed notes about his gardens and that those notes are still used today by the gardeners. Is that true?
It is true. As I was saying, fortunately, the notes is rather than keeping the notes, he did notes for his gardeners, which were kept. And when I wrote my Monet at Giverny back in 2001, I went to his step-great-grandson, had a flat in Paris, and he had 2 rooms filled with photographs and papers and everything else, and there's still so much to find. I might say one of the best writers on Monet is the wonderful American Paul Hayes Tucker, whose detail is absolutely exquisite and well worth, if you want lots and lots of detail. Very good.
Wonderful, thank you. Lee in Cambridge in the United Kingdom says, is Monet's vegetable garden still in existence? And if so, can you visit it?
You can go and stay there. It's Maison Bleu, and the kitchen, no, it isn't, is the short answer. But you can go and stay in it, and it's a sort of bed and breakfast.
Thank you. Roxana in the United States says, which one of your books would you recommend to a beginner on this topic?
My books, I like that. I think from the Monet, it has to be Monet at Giverny. Well, if you want to have water plants and you want the history of the water garden, I also wrote Water Lilies and Brûle-à-Tourmaliac, the genius behind Monet's Water Lilies, which goes into greater detail and gives you all the history of the water lilies. So if you're looking for a water garden, absolutely. If you're looking to get a sense of the man, the gardens and his paintings, then Monet at Giverny fills that bill.
Wonderful, thank you. Gail in Branford in the United States says, do you have any insight into Monet's personality? Was he an introvert or an extrovert or a romantic?
Very good. Do you know, I think it's an absolute miracle that Blanche Hochet didn't stick a sharp knife through his ribs, if I'm going to be perfectly honest. He was impossible. And yet, he terrific temper tantrums. And actually, one of my little insight into his personality, and they wouldn't let me put it in Monet at Giverny because they said it was an inappropriate thing to put in. But when he was away painting in Etretat, Alice had, we haven't got her letter, but she kept all of Monet's letters, which we've seen. Anyway, she'd obviously written and said she was having a pretty awful time with the 8 children and that she'd had enough and he needn't bother to come home because she was leaving him. And he writes back and says, I've been unable to do any painting at all because you've hurt me so much and I've been unable to get out of bed all day. And I said, did Alice at home with the 8 children think, lucky you, lying in bed feeling sorry for yourself? But that would be rather a female attitude to it. So against that, he was obviously very good company. And it's the sort of the temper of the genius. I think, is it permissible today to behave like that? People made sure that life went as smoothly as it could for him. And Blanche was so good to him. So, and you know, he didn't leave her a penny. He left everything to that feckless son of his, Michel. You've got me off on going on now. So, but I still warm to him because of his enthusiasm and the way he writes about his plants and the circle of friends he had round him. And he was a man of his time. But I do think I wish he'd left Blanche slightly more comfortably off, but he didn't.
Thank you. Next question is from Carol in the United States. She says, can one set up and paint themselves when they're at Giverny?
Now, that's a very good question. I don't know what, again, with the openings after COVID, they used to have, when the gardens were closed on a Monday, and I'm not up to date on this, but they did have Monday as a closed day, except for artists. So it would be certainly well worthwhile finding out about that. I can't give you an exact answer.
Thank you. And this is probably the last question we've got time for tonight. This one comes from Linda in South Orange in the United States. And she says, out of all of his gorgeous paintings, did Monet have a favourite?
Oh, not that. I'm going to answer that. Not that I know would be my straightforward answer, but I've talked about, and we talked about his personality, and I briefly mentioned Suzanne Hochet, and Suzanne Hochet was Alice Hochet's second daughter. She had 4 daughters and 2 sons, and Monet loved Suzanne as a model. And obviously there was a bond between the 2 of them. And tragically, she died in, I think it was 1893. She'd had her second child and she never recovered, very much like Camille. And you feel he kept a wonderful painting he did of her coming through a cornfield. And whether that's an emotional attachment or anything else, I don't know, but that is my gut feeling.
Thank you so much, Caroline. I think we've answered most of the questions that could come in. We've got some nice comments here. I'll just read out from Tinky in Richmond. She says, thank you so much for the lovely detailed presentation. I've been to Giverny and loved it, but now I wish to return with a keener eye.
Good.